Hello everyone. Recently I decided to replay Fire Emblem 3 Houses again, and I just feel like talking about it a little bit. In particular, I want to talk about the somewhat vague backstory in 3 Houses, and in particular, the nature of one of its major villains, Nemesis. So before I begin, obviously this video is going to spoil basically all of 3 Houses, and of course Fodland hasn't exactly been the most pleasant place to live in for a lot of people, so just consider this kind of a general catch-all content warning for things like abusive relationships and just a whole lot of violence. Also take this as a warning that this video is going to have a healthy dose of speculation and obvious opinions on my part, but it should be clear when I'm doing that. By the way, I've never played the spin-off 3 Hopes, since I'm not really into warrior-style gameplay, but my understanding is that that game takes place in an alternate timeline. I'm sure there might be some details there that might help inform me a little bit more, but I'm just making it clear that I'm not familiar with whatever details you are given there. So I'm going to start with a whole lot of opinions here. Fire Emblem 3 Houses is one of those games where every time I play it, I'm just thinking the whole time how it's obvious the game is struggling against a deadline that they've pushed back over and over, as well as a lack of time, or possibly funds, to realize the full scale of the story they want to tell. So it's definitely a very flawed game overall. But despite that, it's one of those games I can't really stop thinking about because of just how interesting the backstory and history they've constructed is. And a big part of that comes from just how unreliable, or at the very least heavily skewed, the perspectives we get on what happened in the past of Fodland are. And given the amount of discussion and continued interest I've seen for the game, I think it really goes to show how much a well-conceived world can draw in players and keep them talking about the game for a long time. Even when like 90% of your in-game cutscenes are really obviously just 2 character models talking with each other in this weird void with the background cheaply pasted in. But enough about me nitpicking the game, let's talk about something slightly less nerdy, like the fictional history of a fantasy setting. I'm going to split this video into roughly 3 parts, and I'll put time codes in case you want to jump to a particular section. First, I'm going to review the actual facts or perspectives given by the game itself, and maybe for some outside information like interviews and intelligence system staff. In the second section, I'm roughly going to be giving my own speculation as to certain aspects of the history that they've been given, and I'll finish it off by doing kind of an overall discussion and probably just insert some more speculation here and there. So let's get started.
Part 1. The stuff they actually tell you.
So in the game, there are mainly 3 perspectives the history has told you from. One is from Rhea and the Nabateans. The second one is from the Argarthans, also known as those who slither in the dark. And the third is that there's actually a bit of perspective from other humans. By the way, when I use the word human, it's usually going to refer to common people who are not Nabateans or the Argarthans. I mean, the Argarthans are technically also human, or at least they used to be. But anyway, Rhea's perspective is definitely the one that gets the most screen time. So let's start with that one. Like I said, it's the one that you get the most information on. You learn most of it towards the tail end of the Silver Snow and Verdant Wind paths. She tells you the story of Sothis coming from a faraway place, possibly even from outer space. She gave her blood to birth her children, the Nabateans, who then shared their knowledge with the people of the land. Unfortunately, these people started engaging in senseless wars, and eventually they got so arrogant they decided to even challenge Sothis, the goddess herself. So most humans were killed in this struggle, and the leftover humans who escaped became those who slither in the dark. Sothis was pretty tired after getting most of humanity killed and having to heal the land afterwards that she went into a deep sleep. So sometime afterwards, Nemesis was manipulated by the Argarthans to kill Sothis. They don't really explain exactly how he does this, but I guess it's not that important. Nemesis then drinks or otherwise consumes her blood in some way to gain the Crest of Flames, and he also turns her bones into the Sword of the Creator. Afterwards, Nemesis kind of casually goes do a genocide on the Nabateans, and he uses that to give his 11 best generals crests and sacred weapons in a similar fashion to how he got his own, and later on they became known as the 10 Elites. Sometime after that, the opening of the game happens. Rhea allies with the first Emperor of Adrestia, and it culminates in her stabbing the shit out of Nemesis, and then the rest of the game happens. And for my interest in particular here, I think it's worth noting that Rhea dismisses Nemesis as a, quote, mere bandit. We don't get that much about the perspective of the Argarthans in terms of a recap of events. What we do know from the ones we actually meet in the game is that they are really, really angry, and they have been angry for well over 1,000 years. So most of the lines you see them speaking to you during the game is just them talking about how pissed off they are, which, fair enough, if I was plotting my revenge for 1,000 years, I'd probably stop being a particularly good conversationalist too. We do, however, also get a partial perspective of the Agarthan's point of view from the Shadow Library in the DLC, with the excerpt from Romance of the World's Perdition. In truth, it doesn't really say much you don't already know from just playing the game, or you couldn't already infer. For example, it tells you that the Agarthans denounced Sothis as a false god, and that multiple human civilizations were decimated in their struggle to, at least in their view, break free from their tormentor. But it also notes that, quote, the children of men who spilled too much of the blood of life. So in this sense, it doesn't seem like the actual events are too different from how Rhea describes them. It's just from a different point of view. Also worth noting that the Agarthans don't seem to have a particularly high opinion of Nemesis either. So, the last perspective is the perspective of the humans who lived during the civilization after Sothis rebuilt society, or at least regenerated the land. First, we have something Edelgard tells you during the Crimson Flower route. Edelgard claims that the Adrestan Emperors passed down the truth of the War of the Heroes to each other, and that Nemesis was not a corrupted king, but rather an all-powerful ruler, and the idea that he was corrupted was just an excuse by Seiros, so that Adrestia and the Church could take control of Fodlan. Another human perspective we hear is from the Shadow Library in the book Fragments of a Forgotten Memoir. So this memoir is written by one of the 11 generals who followed Nemesis, and it is a few months after his death. We're not really sure who it is, other than that it's obviously not Daphnel. Some had speculated it's actually Maurice. But anyway, we just know that he or she abandoned their son and daughter, who were given clemency by the Empire. And they're also clearly confused as to why Seiros hates them, so it confirms that Nemesis kept the secrets of crests and relics hidden even from the 10 elites. Which I guess means that Nemesis either pretended that Nabatean blood was like a magic potion or something, or he conducted some kind of fancy ritual for his generals and just slipped the blood in there at some point. So there's the perspectives I can think of from the game. And that leads us to
Part 2. I make up a bunch of stuff.
So going over each perspective, obviously Rhea is just about the only person left over to give an actual first-hand account of what happened, being the last surviving direct child of Sothis. But it's also fair to say that she probably has an obvious bias in favor of the church that she is in charge of. And I really don't think it's a stretch to say that time might have eroded or distorted her memory a little bit over the years. Also, she's like one really bad day away from going totally axe crazy, so that might be worth considering too. As for the Agarthan's account, like I said when recapping it, it doesn't seem like the actual events of the few Agarthan accounts we get is actually that much different than what Rhea says. They were just on the opposite side of the conflict. However, it is the view of the non-Nabatean and non-Agarthan humans that I find the differences most compelling, particularly to the nature of Nemesis. Assuming we take Edelgard at her word, I mean, some people like to argue that Edelgard's account might have been false information given to her by those who slither in the dark, but I think it's way more interesting if we assume she's telling the truth. Plus, clearly, people like the 10 elites were willing to follow the guy and take cups of mysterious blood-colored liquid from the guy to get magic powers, so clearly he had some kind of legitimate influence as a leader of men. Plus, there's a Nintendo Dream interview with the devs that happened around the release of the DLC that supports this reading. Question. Why did Seiros, Rhea, leave Nemesis and Fodlan's 10 elites as heroes in history? Kusakihara. Because from the human side, Nemesis and the 10 elites were thought of as heroes. When you're ruling over humanity, you can't exactly create a history that completely ignores humanity's feelings. So the idea is she held them up as heroes while rewriting other parts to be more convenient for her. However, when Seiros and friends tampered with history, they weren't doing it for the sake of ruling over humanity, but rather for the purpose of minimizing war as much as possible and making it easier to preserve harmony. Like you see in the Underground Library, they even suppressed the advancement of civilization when it was getting too fast. There's a reason for that too, but that's a secret. I will say one thing that strikes me a bit odd from this quote is the claim that they weren't doing it for the sake of ruling over humanity. It might be something lost in translation or something, but it sounds like if you're just doing something so that everybody calms down enough so that they'll listen to your give peace a chance mentality, for practical purposes it seems like it's kind of a distinction without a difference. Especially given how the church ends up being such a huge authority in Fodlan. Anyway, with all this in mind, let me give my own personal guess as to what happened, and honestly most of this information is just given to you anyway. So, in the ancient past, Sothis ruled alongside her direct children, the Nabateans, over humanity, sharing their power and knowledge as best as they could to help humanity grow. But using this newfound knowledge, humanity warred with each other continuously, which culminated in challenging Sothis herself, leading to the destruction of almost all of humanity, which is when those who slither in the dark were formed. After Sothis successfully heals the land, she goes into a slumber to recover her strength, while instructing her children to withdraw from the world and leave humanity alone. Unfortunately, the Agarthans had been plotting their revenge for a long time, and they enticed a lowly bandit called Nemesis with the promise of power and a better life. With the tools from the Agarthans alongside the location of the sleeping Sothis, Nemesis killed her, consumed her blood, and made the Sword of the Creator. He then slaughtered the Nabateans so that he could have a source of power for those who would follow him. Assumedly, Nemesis also killed people who knew the secret of the Nabateans' crests and relics, or at least kept the secret confined to a very small group of people, not even including some of his best generals. So from there, the legend of Nemesis grew, a lowly man who grew into one of the greatest rulers of his time, and people who followed him will be granted godlike powers. All the while, Seiros flees to Enbar, having witnessed the slaughter of her people, where she meets up with her fellow surviving Nabateans, such as Trikel and Sithleen, and eventually she meets Wilhelm, who she gives her blood, as part of her plan to enact her revenge on Nemesis. Alright, so with my speculation in mind, I guess we can move on to
Part 3, I make up even more stuff.
The thing I find most compelling about Three Houses is the society that the developers constructed. Every character has some kind of trauma or character trait that is associated specifically with the society depicted, even with a mostly joke character like Bernadetta, for instance. Her entire personality and backstory is the result of societal pressures which produced abusive men like her father. And this is why I make the speculation that Sothis deliberately told the Nabateans to leave humanity alone, or at least not share their knowledge, after initial disaster with the Agarthans. It makes the most sense to me that Sothis, who tried to guide humanity with benevolence, saw the disastrous result of her initial rule and decided it was best that she leave humanity to their own devices and that the Nabateans live their own lives in peace. It's also consistent with what we see the Church and Rhea doing over the course of the game. Rhea herself is always trying her best to channel her interpretation of her mother, being a loving caretaker of humanity as much as she can, while trying to avoid the mistakes that Sothis made in her first rule. For example, the Church deliberately suppresses scientific developments in Fodlan, possibly to prevent humanity from unlocking the same knowledge and technologies that gave the Agarthans long life and let them create things like the Javelins of Light. It also kind of helps to put into context why Rhea flies completely off the deep end, as much as she does in the ending of Crimson Flower. Here's this woman who has every reason to hate humanity. I mean, she literally witnessed the genocide of her people, but in her mind, not only has she forgiven much of humanity's sins, but she has given as much love and care as she can think to give in the image of her mother, and then Byleth still betrays her, and basically plans on finishing the slaughter that Nemesis started? It doesn't make what she does in that ending okay, but I can at least see where she's coming from. But to me, this leaves me to the big question here. What was the state of the world after Sothis had healed it, while the Nabateans were simply living in peace as Rhea tells it? Or in other words, what was the society like that led to the rise of Nemesis? Personally, I like to assume that even though Sothis did her best to heal the land, it was still a pretty inhospitable place. Obviously, Sothis herself was too tired from healing the land to help humanity anymore, but it seems like the Nabateans that stayed in Fodlan basically just kept to themselves. Personally, I interpret Nemesis as being somewhat similar to villains like Rudolph or Walhart in other Fire Emblem games, a man of great ambition who aims to lead humanity to a new golden era and is completely ruthless in this pursuit. It also fits the MO of the Agarthans pretty well if you think about it. They tend to stick to things like political assassinations or helping people who are likely going to start a revolution anyway. For example, Lug and the House of Blaiddyd long had conflicts with the House of Hresfeld, so the Agarthans simply exploited that. And of course we have the plot of the game itself, Edelgard and her frustrations with the society built around crests and nobility. So, just to be even more explicit with what I'm trying to say here, my speculation is that during the time that Sothis began her slumber, the Nabateans enjoyed prosperous lives thanks to their ancient knowledge that they always had, while refusing to share this knowledge with the newly struggling human societies in Fodlan, for fear of the same mistakes being repeated. In this situation, it doesn't surprise me that a common man would find a man like Nemesis inspiring. We are told that the people of the time genuinely viewed Nemesis as a hero. So I want to end this video by pointing out something that comes up in the story somewhat often. There's this sort of general theme that kind of permeates the story that history will repeat itself over time, and we can see this in both the conflicts and the characters themselves. For example, in Dimitri's story, the one where I argue Fodlan changes the least by the end, is all about his all-consuming guilt and his anger twisting what is normally a pretty stand-up guy into a monster. He ends up mostly siding with the Church, and if you think about it, Dimitri and his struggle does sound a little similar to another person. I mean, I can certainly think of at least one other character in the game who survived a horrible massacre and had to learn to let that go, and care for a world that feels like it betrayed him. Then we have the central point of conflict in Three Houses, the Church of Seiros. Elgard asked Byleth during the Crimson Flower route if the person leading the world should have humanity, or be some kind of unknown creature that can masquerade as a human. Claude also wants to change the world to fit his own ideals, though obviously with different goals from Edelgard. For both of them, it goes back to rejecting their lot in life and wanting the world to fit their vision of what a better world is. You can probably characterize them both as disillusioned youths who want to oppose the rule of the gods, or at the very least those in authority, or maybe fate itself. Though one big difference, of course, is that Edelgard believes in this so much, she's willing to work with the same people who tortured her and killed her family to achieve her ambitions. Kind of parallels a certain King of Liberation, wouldn't you say? Meanwhile, Claude believes in the power of friendship.